All right, in this video, we're going to be looking at 10.4 genetic equilibrium. We've been talking about natural selection. We've been talking about things that are changing, right? What is equilibrium? It's when things don't change. And so we need to get a few definitions before we do that. First, looking at these two ideas, microevolution and macroevolution. Microevolution is what we've been talking about, right? It is essentially where you have a change or small changes from one generation to the next that are going to move that population in a particular direction, right? In the picture here, what is the direction? Giraffes with long necks survive, right? And so what would you expect for neck length of giraffes to do over time? Lengthen. That is microevolution, right? The giraffes with short necks are going to die, and the long neck giraffes are going to live, and these small changes in a population are going to be seen. Now, what happens when you have these big changes? What if the small necked giraffes start using a different resource and eventually split off and become their own thing, right? And so what we call this is macroevolution. Macroevolution is when you're changing from one species to the next. Think of the creation of a new species. We're going to give that a different name in another lecture. But for now, we're just going to think of this as big changes. Macro means big. Here you have the macroevolution of whales. It's thought that whales came from tetrapods. There it is. Looks like a rat, Elimorix, or whatever, how you ever say that. Then Pakicetus and Rhodocetus, and then Durodon. These are macro changes, right? This is going from this thing that looks like a big rat dog to a thing that looks like a big fish whale. You get the idea. Big changes as opposed to long neck giraffes live. You get the idea. So, what does this mean? Well, we're going to talk about this with this idea of a gene pool. Gene pool is all the genes in a population, right? The big B's, the little b's, the big B, little b's, the big B, big B's, the little b, little b's. All of that is represented in a population, and there are percentages associated with that, right? There are percentages of big B's, there are percentages of little b's in the population, and we call this the gene pool, all right? What happens if that gene pool changes over time? Well, that's called evolution. And so we're going to add a little bit of a definition to our definition of evolution. We actually hinted at this in a previous video, that evolution is not merely the change in a population over time, but it's the change in allele frequencies over time, or the frequency of alleles. So what do we mean by that? Well, let's look at this picture. There's 9 flowers, pea flowers represented here, and there are their genotypes there. Every pea flower has 2 genes, right, or 2 alleles. We have a big W or a little w, two of each, or one of each, or whatever. And so each allele has a relative frequency. There's 18 total alleles in this picture, right? And let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 13 big W's, and did I get that right? Yeah, and 5 little w's. So 13 out of 18 is the big W, 5 out of 18 is the little w. And what if you came back, I don't know, in several 100,000 years, and that frequency had changed? We would call that evolution, right? That's what we would call that. And so these two guys, Hardy and Weinberg, came up with this idea called the Hardy-Weinberg principle, where you can kind of track the change in alleles, right? They came up with these equations, which we're not going to learn in this class. And they also came up with this concept called genetic equilibrium, or sometimes you'll see it called Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. But for our class, we're going to call it genetic equilibrium. And this is the idea that, and we'll get to that next slide in a minute. This is the idea that if a population is at genetic equilibrium, it is not changing over time, right? That'd be like coming back in a million generations, and it'd still be these 13 over 18 and 5 over 18, right? Is that likely to happen? No, because giraffes with short necks die, right? Giraffes with long necks live. We're going to see a change in the allele frequency. And so there are certain conditions that must be present in order for this to occur. What are they? There's 5. First is random mating. What does that mean? That means that there's no reason that one mate would choose another, that all mates are equally viable, and so the choice of a mate is random. Population must be large population, so that any change in that population is imperceptible, right? A smaller population is going to detect change easier. No natural selection, meaning that there's no competition for resources. There's no differential reproductive success. Small neck giraffes live too, right? No mutations, meaning that there's no new phenotypes that are going to be introduced to the genome or the gene pool that is going to cause a change in that population. And no migration, meaning that populations are not moving, or individuals are not moving between populations and thus changing the gene pool of those populations. These 5 conditions must be present in order for genetic equilibrium to exist. If they're not, then guess what's going to happen to the allele frequency over time? It's going to change. What do we call that? We call that evolution, right? Now, there's ways to measure this. Within a given population, you're going to have what we're going to call standard selection, meaning that there's going to be a particular set of traits that is being selected for, that the selection pressures in a particular environment are going to want a particular trait, right? Let's go to neck length in giraffes, for instance, right? Neck length in the giraffes is going to be pretty standard. If it's too long, maybe giraffes are going to have some problems anatomically. If it's too short, they can't reach the leaves and they can't eat. And so the extremes, the too long and the too short, are going to be less, but right in the middle, that's the sweet spot, and that's what this is showing, right? The number of individuals on the y-axis, the quantification of a trait, in this case, neck length on the x-axis, and you see this kind of bell. Well, if it became, if it became a situation where the population of giraffes, well, those with longer necks lived, what would you expect to see in this graph? You'd expect it to change, right? And so we're going to give 3 examples of how this graph can change. The first one's called stabilizing selection. Stabilizing selection is where the median or the average is selected for and the extremes are selected against. Good example of this is human birth weight. With human birth weight, the average birth weight is the best chance to survive. A really low birth weight is a lower chance to survive. A really high birth weight is a lower chance to survive. And so rather than having that original population, that standard selection, here we have, you see the red line there, you have a higher survivability in the averages, and so we call this stabilizing selection. What's next? Directional selection. This was the long neck giraffe thing I was talking about. This is where one extreme is selected for and the other is against. In this case, we have color. Light color being on one extreme, dark color being on the other. For some reason, dark-colored moths were selected for. In this case, soot covered the bark of trees that were previously white. This actually happened in real life in England. And the soot-covered trees, now white moths are stick out and the hawks come and eat them, and the dark moths live. And so you see a directional selection in that population. Dark moths are now more camouflaged than they once were. And so you see populations moving toward the extreme and away from the other extreme. This is called directional selection. And then there's disruptive selection. Disruptive selection is where the extremes are selected for and the average is selected against. So what would this look like? Well, in this particular case with these butterflies, you have 2 different butterfly phenotypes. You have the light-colored and the dark-colored. And in this particular case, the light and dark-colored mimic what we would call unpalatable butterflies, meaning the birds don't want to eat them because they don't taste good, right? They mimic the ones that don't taste good, and so birds won't eat them. But the hybrid between dark and light is this orange color, and they don't mimic anything. Birds eat them. They love them. And so in this particular case, the average of the 2 is selected against, meaning the birds are eating them. The extremes then are selected for, showing that those in the extreme cases are going to live, and those birds or those butterflies in the middle are not going to make it.